to all. This is so exciting for me as a professor who at one time was able to work with Sky Hopinka on many, many events and many projects and many films that he was already creating. And I'm so thrilled to be with Sky Hopinka at this Realities of Science Fiction conference. The title that I gave this very little talk is called Mabi Echi Zagak, This Great Love. In our Anishinaabé language, we have many, many, many different kinds of phrases for love, like Kise Wadithwan, which means unconditional love. And that's something that we use as Anishinaabe values. Or Tejogan, if you know someone a little bit better, and that means love today, tomorrow, and forever. And there are many, many, many other expressions of compassion, mercy, love, and tenderness among our communities. So Mabi Echi Zaga, this great love, explaining the Ninawemagaan, or the kinship of Indigenous futurisms. The thing that stood out to me right away is the beautiful title for this conference, The Realities of Science Fiction. And as Flora, Simon, Victor, and others we have discussed together, really Indigenous futurisms is about taking the fiction out of science fiction. And I want to credit Helen Haig Brown from the Chakotay Nation for coming up with that expression when she was on a Lars von Trier film experiment, had been working with a lot of documentaries from an Indigenous feminist perspective with her own grandmother, her own mother, herself, and others learning their languages. And this is the feature that Sky Hopinka's films really stand out as an aspect of Indigenous futurisms, because there's a reality that is always behind any kind of native slipstream. Sky's films have these beautiful moments of native slipstream that I suggested we could call it in the anthology Walking the Clouds, Indigenous Science Fiction. And native slipstream is something as simple as Leslie Marmon Silko, who is both Laguna Pueblo and also Mexicana, as she points out in her memoir, The Turquoise Ledge. And in that, she suggests the idea of her grandmother teaching her about physics, time travel, time slippages, reality slippages, by simply picking up a tortilla that she had just made on the griddle for their family, and took this tortilla and then talked about, instead of having a past, present, future in some kind of simple chronological order, that rather time is like the tortilla. And she took the tortilla and she folded it over, and she showed how points A and B that seemed on the far, far side of the tortillas can actually come together in many kinds of moments. And those moments could be referred to as native slipstream, because as even really well-known and popular shows like Taika Waititi's and Sterling Harjo's Reservation Dogs, available on Hulu, you will see that in the world of living, we have living of all kinds, including body, mind, spirit. That's a strong feature that, as Isiah Lavender III, who's African American himself and now probably regarded as the top notch African American or Afro futurism and African futurisms expert in the world, and has written many books on that. The kinship of indigenous futurists is very important, because with indigenous futurisms, although you see the word future in there, since we have native slipstream and the kind of rethinking of space-time itself, in many ways, that kinship of indigenous futurisms is the high context of not just simply being in a lab with beakers, and we have that going on even at tribal colleges with modified genetic engineering and other kinds of forms. But I think more importantly, we are sharing our discoveries, and all discoveries, because for us as Anishinaabe and me people, tradition for us actually means change. It means adapting constantly to change. And in fact, Kyle White, who is Potawatomi, which is a nation very closely aligned with the Anishinaabe nations, speaking nations. And he is an amazing Potawatomi climate scientist who has been, along with many other indigenous scholars now, have been taking a look at both climate justice intertwined with environmental justice. And these are the very practical and real directions that a lot of indigenous futurisms is taking now, is to look at the situation of our land around us. For instance, Joshua Whitehead, who's Oji Cree and Two Spirit, has collected a very beautiful, beautiful collection called Love at the End of the World, and it's indigenous speculative literature. And I should mention here that since he is located in Canada, his nation is in Canada, or nations, I should say, the idea of speculative literature really took hold in Canada in the 1990s as a way of exploring stories that would combine elements of science fiction, the fantastic, horror, and have mixes going on with it. And to tell you the truth, in a lot of ways, the CoFuturisms that I've just referred to have heavily influenced in the film industry, in graphic novels, video games, music, 3D immersions, many, many, many forms of digital projects, TV shows, like Wayne Blair, who's Australian First Nations, and created the Cleverman TV show of 2 seasons that I think is still running on Netflix, and so many more. Joshua Whitehead just came out with a new book called Making Love with the Land. And in many ways, that's what so many forms of indigenous futurisms just automatically take on. Um, and so Joshua Whitehead, he is illuminating our complex moment that we're living through right now, in which indigenous and non-indigenous peoples and allies are navigating new and old ideas about the land. Joshua, in this sense, asks, what is our relationship and responsibility towards it? And how has the land shaped ideas, histories, words, our very bodies? Um, and that is just a very beautiful book that after all of his works with indigenous futurisms. Now, I also wanted to mention a few other things that to take a look at, and that is that many of us are busy decolonizing the Anthropocene. I serve on the ethnic board of the International Space Station currently, and also this past summer was invited to a NASA workshop that really wanted to hear uh, voices globally as intellectuals throughout the world. And I was also heavily involved in what was called Project North Star, uh, which actually, in this case, brought in US intellectuals from all over. And in the process, we were talking about all kinds of things because we were visioning 50 to 100 years ahead of time for the USA as a country. And in the process, this ended up being just very, very exciting 4 to 5 hours at a time conversations and pulling things together. President Biden and the White House staff at this point has received that report, and they were very, very, very excited. And that white paper will be published this coming January 2023, along with the Routledge Handbook of CoFuturisms, which is also coming out in 2023. What we all have in mind and what Sky brings in so beautifully, along with our revitalization of our languages, where we can feel free to bring in our words and then put the English in quotes afterwards. And that's kind of a indigenous stylistic that I'm now passing on to students and communities as well. Because that way we're keeping our languages alive and we're sharing what could be tricky concepts to grasp in plain English. But we do have many values, and these values are truly meant for Giwatan Kumik all around the world, not just on our tribal nation land, but all around the world. In Ishpeming, in the sky above. In Eikudawu Dunak Mishigishik, or space, the vault of heaven. All of these in indigenous futurisms and the storytelling that is always implicit in our indigenous sciences, where we have dance, drumming, ceremony, stories that are always intertwined ceremonially with discoveries of various sciences internationally around the world. because we take all of that in along with our local knowledges that we play with. As I grew up, that meant I was often in the woods by my tribal bands, Bay Mills Nation, Garden River Nation, and the Salto Nation with some aunties and uncles. And we would employ what is called Gikandaswan, or the teaching and knowledges of plant nations, animal nations, all of us as living beings, respecting mutually each other. Um, and so that becomes very important. And so with Indigenous futurisms, there's this exciting opportunity to become mamikad kumik. And I should say that mitsu kumikwa is our term for Mother Earth. And mamikad kumik means out of this world, fantastic, wonder of wonders, extraordinary. So even as we talk about realities of science fiction and taking the fiction out of science fiction, as Helen Hag Brown has put it, it still remains stories that are out of this world, fantastic, wonder of wonders, and extraordinary. And the kind of techniques that Skyho Pinka reveals in his films has all of those incredible qualities. And it allows us to dream, to conjure, and to imagine with the Waji Jamin, to dream or dreaming, with Bawan Egewen, to seek or conjure a dream, or Inabendu Moan, to imagine. And what we're interested in imagining is, I grew up with stories of space canoes. They were birch bark canoes that we called Wigwasi Jimon, space canoes, as birch bark canoes in the sky. We also are very interested in Chichakun, or spirit, soul, and what we actually just call the principle of life. And what I hope that you can take away from just this little bit of a talk is that we appreciate not only our Gid Udam Inag Nig, or our blood relations, our clans as a web of kinship, but perhaps more importantly, for Indigenous futurisms communities, we form Giro du de Minanog, our kinship system that is not necessarily by direct blood relations, but by our acknowledged social relations and roles that we share with each other. Hopefully, Enigi, I am healing up, or Nanandawi, changing your healing vibration, becomes part of our vibrations together, helping for some of us, or many of us, Jajigiwin, having still open and leaking and unhealed wounds, or in a trauma, a scar that hasn't been healed yet. Because in many ways, through Indigenous futurisms, whether told through film like Skyho Pinka and Helen Hag Brown, or through many other kinds of forms, graphic novels like Moonshot Volume 3, in many ways, Anishinaabé, we are the medicine.
Beautiful.
I hope that was okay. Write that out at all.
Hi, Grace. Can you hear us? Can you see us? We don't hear you. Ah, is there sound?
I just unmuted.
Oh, perfect. Hello, Grace. Thank you for this beautiful talk. Is there any questions now in the audience? Yes, I can start by one to start. I just wanted to ask you the book that you're working on now. It's called Handbook of CoFuturism. What does it mean, CoFuturism? Can you explain this, maybe? Thank you.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I just want to also add that I'll send the real Anishinaabé words because I didn't send you the correct spelling, so I'll do that for you as well. But the Routledge Handbook of CoFuturisms is a combination of Afrofuturism, which we all know historically is the first futurism that exists in this kind of arena. We have indigenous futurisms, African futurisms, Latinx futurisms, Asian futurisms, Gulf futurisms or Arabic futurisms that also coincide with Israeli futurisms. And we call it co-futurisms because there has been interested in BIPOC futurisms, Black, Indigenous, and peoples of color futurisms. But as we were working through this handbook, which kept expanding and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and the Routledge publishers gave us permission to do so, we were realizing that many Black and Brown peoples globally around the world don't fit neatly into the category of BIPOC futurisms. We also, following up on the conversation that it was so wonderful and I just listened to, we're also wanting to show that we are not simply other. We are not alternative futurisms. We are mutually futurisms or futurities or futures together.
Thank you. That's a really nice answer. Is there...
D'autres questions? On peut poser des questions en français et les traduire, bien sûr, s'il y en a. Je regarde. In the meantime, I'll ask you a question, Grace. Thank you for your talk. Like I don't know how it relates completely to sci-fi, but somehow it is. Like you talked at a point of like the strategies that you were working on to decolonize the Anthropocene, knowing that the very term Anthropocene, coming from the Greek, could be itself part of the problem. But I'm very interested because you've been doing that work of like what are some of the interesting leads, interesting strategies that you've found so far, or that you've been revolving around, let's say.
And thank you, Shay McWetch, for that question. There's been, in reference to the other talk that we just had, where we were discussing our dystopia forms of fiction, do they remain important? For us, they are inevitably a part of our stories, although more often we call that native apocalypse. And in terms of decolonizing the Anthropocene, Kyle Powys White and so many others. Chelsea Ball, who's Métis, and just came out with a new collection called The New Buffalo is Buffalo. uh, in all of those cases, we have survived the kind of migrations and movements that were entailed with such devastating loss of some of our areas or being intentionally relocated that it also felt like we suddenly needed to learn about plant and animal nations in a new way. One thing that has come up recently in decolonizing the Anthropocene is to recognize how much we as indigenous peoples have been migrating. We migrate during our seasons to gather and collect different kinds of foods and medicines. All of that is a part of migration. And so Kyle Powys White and others have written recently about the importance of not only recognizing indigenous sciences, but also recognizing the migratory routes that were taken by indigenous peoples as we now experience climate migrations and many groups of people that are having to relocate because of what is happening to their own lands, water, and so many other features to live with.
Thank you very much, Grace. Again, I think a big... une question de Nina. En français, en anglais? En anglais, bien sûr.
Hi, thank you very much. I had one question about CoFuturism and about the process of collecting all these stories, because you mentioned many different geographic and cultural areas, and I was wondering, how do you collect stories from all these different places, and how do you deal with, I guess the book will be in English, but how do you deal with issues of translation and maybe untranslatability from times to times?
Mm-hmm. That's a really wonderful question, and one that we struggled with as editors, since many of us, like Bodhisattva Chattopadhyay, who's Indian and is a professor at the University of Oslo. For many of us, we speak many different languages, and we realize that this particular Routledge Handbook is in English, but we always encourage writers, scholar activists to use their own language and then go ahead and explain it or describe it. And I should probably clarify that this collection is a scholarly collection. And at this point, we have more than 50 to 60 voices globally across the world that are writing about the futurisms that they come from and are centered from. So for instance, Nadia Korafor, who is also at the NASA workshop with me, and really coined the term African futurisms. She also works with languages that sometimes better explain concepts than when it happens in English, and it enriches our conversations. To also take your point, a lot of podcasts, radio shows, TV shows, other kinds of things that I've been involved with are now spoken in Spanish, turned into Spanish, and other kinds of languages worldwide. And so I think that that kind of beautiful meeting of minds through our languages really opens up further the realities of science fiction.
Thank you so much. Ethel, you wanted to ask one quick question with maybe a quick answer before we pass on to Vas-y.
I'll try my best because this question is still forming. But essentially, first of all, thank you so much for everything that you offered. And I want to ask a question about ways of knowing and a little bit historicizing science as a discipline that comes out of, Renaissance, Enlightenment, and this idea of the world as observable and knowable that has really in a hierarchical way, centered the mind as a way through which we receive and process information. And within science fiction, kind of weaving in the talk we just had right before yours with Peter Watson, AJ, and kind of all of the talks that we've had that are about just different ways of knowing and memory in the body, and then this thing about the mind and, like rigor and Adam's talk, I'm not sure if you heard it, but it was about dreams, and it was this beautiful thing where Adam shared kind of the difficulty of studying dreams within scientific institutions because it's not considered quote-unquote real science. So I think it kind of gets to this root of all of these entanglements with what is considered legitimate. Science is like centering the mind as the only legitimate way of knowing, and then what happens when we open up to dreams, to the body, to memory, to ancestry, to all of these other ways of knowing that we're still processing through kind of science without discarding it, not processing through, but in conjunction with. And so I'm curious, just as an academic yourself and everybody that you referenced and mentioned, there's like so many ways in which these things are not dichotomies, but they're in conversation and can open each other up in some ways. So I don't know the question, but that's what I'm left like marinating with after the talks today, and I'm just handing, that's all.
Oh, that just moves my heart to hear that, because so many futurisms are really body, mind, spirit. And so they're a fuller context than the old 1980s cyberpunk fetishization of mind versus body. And can we get rid of that me? And so CoFuturisms, Gregory Cajete, as an Acoma Pueblo man himself and a scientist, we use sciences in plural at all times. That is a westernized notion, I think, to talk about science as simply science, singularly. And Colin Milburn was at a International for the Fantastic and Arts conference with him, and we were just discussing this together. And he was pointing out that coinage of science was really firmed up in the 1950s, and that we should go back to pluralizations of sciences. So for Gregory Cajete, the low context is when you're simply observing and using beakers and a lab, and you may go out into the field, but then you come back with specified taxonomic systems. And with our sciences, we accompany it with song and ceremony and dance and music. And just to give you two quick examples, Cynthia Coleman, who's Australian First Nations, wrote this beautiful science fiction novel called Terra Nullius. And for a good part of the novel, you don't even realize it's science fiction. But at a certain point, as Gregory Kahete observes, the high context is a multi-contextual system, a body of knowledge built up over generations by culturally distinct people who live in close context with a place. They know how the plants, animals, waters, mountains, deserts, and plains interconnect and sustain life through their myriad cycles. For instance, back in April 2019, the Balangara peoples, Australian First Nations, as Indigenous rangers, aided scientists all across tropical Australia in curbing and helping to halt the massive die-off of yellow-spotted monitors or lizards and quolls, or meat-eating marsupials, from an incursive invasion of gigantic alien cane toads with highly poisonous toxins. Thanks to the Balangara rangers, many of the shy lizard peoples, hard to discern on the landscapes, were brought in and fed a small cane toad as a form of recognizing not to eat or touch cane toads at all. In an 18-month study of genuine cross-cultural collaboration, over half of the trained lizards knew to avoid the cane toads altogether, whereas those not trained died soon after the toads arrived. In Claire G. Coleman's Terra Nullius, the aliens are invading giant cane toads who appear more in a human physical form, but have all the qualities and all of the poisonous toxins of settler colonialism. And so her aliens resemble the actual invasive gigantic alien toads that have come into Australia. Another quick example.
Grace, I'm really sorry, as we really have the time going on and the structure closes. I'm really sorry. I think I have to cut short the second example. We can talk a bit about it right after the talk. But again, apologies for that, but I think we have to go on with Sky. But thank you so much. Another round of applause for Grace Dillon.